All right, so we're continuing our study on evolution, how it fits, if it fits with the biblical view of how life got started, how life now exists on the earth. And hopefully it's been beneficial for you so far. I realize we can get down in the weeds on some of this, but unfortunately that's where the devil's in the details. And I've got to get down in the weeds a little bit to fully cover some of this. Last week, we had covered a few things. Well, no, it wasn't last week. It was the week before, excuse me. So just a small recap of what we covered last week so that as we're going forward, it's a little more clear. So last week, we covered the question, how did life get started? And that is a big problem for the evolutionist that doesn't believe in God. They have a lot to answer for. And the main hypotheses, and one that really gets touted and has been touted for a long time, is the Miller-Urey experiments, where they took, again, 4 different molecules that they thought the atmosphere was made of. They gave it electrical stimulus like lightning, and amino acids were created. Now, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. Proteins are the building blocks of life. That's, basic science class. Now, here's the problem. Amino acids are a long, long way from creating DNA, from creating RNA, and RNA and DNA are useless without a few cellular machinery like ribosomes and things like that in the cells that help the DNA get replicated. We're going to cover a little bit of that today. And I realize, again, this is a church class and not a science class, but I want to give you some of the science so that it's best understood, that you better understand why this is a big deal, because they don't have a good answer for it. And this Miller-Urey experiment, again, for years, for decades now, has been touted as the answer. Well, we can't find that gap just yet, but the science, the technology, when it comes, we'll be able to explain that gap between, amino acids and getting a self-replicating DNA cell. Okay, haven't found that yet. And again, I know that I've mentioned to you that we had at TBI, where I work, and for those of you that don't know me, I work in a lab over at TBI. I'm a forensic scientist there. We had an intern this past summer, and I think I've discussed with you a few of our discussions, and she had told me, confided in me, and said, I don't believe in God, and I believe that you can explain how we're here through science. And we've had many discussions while she was with us at TBI, and one of the things that I brought up, I said, look, I went and tried to find my own answers too. And what I found is that evolution couldn't tell me, how everything began to exist and how life got started. And she goes, well, no, that answer is out there. We know how that happened. I said, really? You do? Can you please point me to that information? She goes, I might have to look for it. And I said, you can look for it, but it's not there. I've already looked for it, and I promise you there'd be headlines if they found that information. It doesn't exist. When you look for it, you'll find something like that. And I did cover this other hypothesis, the ancient cataclysm. And again, it comes to, when you read the article, they say, now look, no rock or other evidence of any kind that supports this hypothesis exists now. But the reason why it's exciting to us is because it answers a bunch of mysteries. Well, yeah, that'd be exciting if we're just making up, stories that how it could have happened that answers a bunch of questions for us. Then, what are we doing here? That's not science. That's just wishful thinking. That's just literally making up the past so it fits your present. And I want to expose you to these things because this is what people base their belief on. And they may not fully understand what they're basing their faith on. And the faith is that, well, at some point, life started from non-life. That didn't happen. We don't have any evidence of that. Now, I wanted to cover the problems with the Miller-Urey model. Okay. Now, scientists now today, although for decades, they have, again, used this model as really the basis for how life got started. Scientists now, most actually disagree with this model. Actually say that geological studies, what we've been studying for a long time, looking back at the fossil record and all those sedimentary layers, when you go back and you test a lot of those things, you're not finding any one of those molecules that the Urey model used to test as the atmosphere. They're saying, look, the atmospheric conditions, we've got no scientific evidence that the atmospheric conditions were as such in the Urey model. So they're already abandoning this Urey model. I bring this up to say that basing your faith on science is basing your faith on shifting sands. Things change all the time in science because the more information you have, the more things change. The more technology we get, the more information we get. And what was touted as fact for years and decades on end gets flipped in an instant when we get more information. Said, oh, now we better understand this, but I get called an idiot for 10 years because I didn't believe what you believed up until this point. As you can tell, this, gets me a little riled up. I say all that to say that we get categorized as, science and fact deniers when we call into question some of these experiments, some of these faith-based beliefs that are being taught as fact. And so that's why I get into the science of it and try to explain it on a little bit deeper level so that you do have an understanding of why it's really not as solid as they want you to believe. And so, again, like I said, the scientists don't agree on the early atmospheric conditions, and the geological studies have not discovered any evidence of methane, ammonia, those two big molecules that were used in the Urey Miller model there. Also, amino acids do not bind in water. This breaks down the ideas of life starting deep underwater near thermal vents. This was the answer in the face of the Urey model. So some are saying, well, actually life got started in this primordial soup as a water-based soup, maybe the ocean at that point, but they're actually getting started right there at the thermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, or whatever this soup was called. But the problem with that is that amino acids actually do not bind in water. They actually thermodynamically go away from each other. They separate. So if amino acids aren't binding, they're not going to make DNA, RNA, those other things. It's not going to happen. So there's really not a good explanation for how life exists, even more so than what's touted right now. Again, I bring all this up to you so that you understand we have good reason to believe that when we look at the data set and we take an objective look at it, the two frameworks that we can view this information through, conventional versus the Genesis, the creation paradigm, creation makes more sense. Now, we are going to play a small section of the video again today that does talk a little bit about DNA, and I'm going to give you a little bit more information on DNA before we move on to, again, animals and the different characteristics of animals. That'll be next week, talking about maybe microevolution versus macroevolution. But to get to that point, you've got to understand what causes those things, which is DNA. That's the information that dictates all of those outward characteristics, those phenotypic characteristics that are expressed outwardly. What you look like is determined by your genes. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I want to lay the groundwork for what we're fixing to go over. So you can play the video.
Rob Carter is a marine biologist, so he took me scuba diving to get a glimpse of a world most people don't see. His specialty was coral, and he knew a lot about the incredible creatures that inhabit the reefs around St. Thomas.
Oh man, we got the sharks here.
I mean, just look how they move, and it's almost like effortlessly glide along. I wish I could swim like that.
Engineers wish we could make boats like that.
Yeah.
Submarines that could move as efficiently as a shark. We can't quite do it.
So from your perspective as a marine biologist, and I know that you've studied the whole area of genetics a lot.
Yes.
When people talk about evolution, what is it?
How do you define evolution? The word means change over time. But I believe in change over time, but I'm not an evolutionist. So how does one figure this out? Really, evolution is a belief that enough change over time, over enough time, can lead to the common ancestry of all species on Earth.
All right.
So that's the part I reject. Of course, species change. I mean, look at these sharks here. We have several different species of sharks. When God created, he put into those organisms the ability to change, to adapt, to respond dynamically to the environment. But they're still sharks. And when we look at the fossil record, they're still sharks. You know, people have heard the phrase the missing link.
Right.
And they usually think of between man and monkeys. No, there's missing links between almost every major group of animal and almost every other major group of animal and plant, even bacteria, throughout the entire fossil record, which indicates very strongly that these are actually different creations.
So we don't get one kind becoming another kind.
No. Evolutionary theory requires that small, random changes can explain everything we see. But it can't.
And why can't it?
Because life is so complex that small changes can't explain it. Just like you can't take a computer operating system and look at it and say, oh yeah, this is built up one digit at a time over any length of time. No, it took an intelligent person to sit down and put it together.
Well, I can guarantee you, as one who was in that world, that if anyone in the area of computer science were to say, if we just randomly change some things in this operating system, it'll get better. I mean, no one would agree with that.
No, we're not going to get the shark to evolve into a bird. That the number of changes and the types of changes are not something that you can do one change at a time. This is a sea urchin.
It looks spiny.
It's pointy. You got to be careful.
Am I going to get stuck if I touch it?
No. He's pointy, but...
Oh my goodness, they're moving.
Yes, they're moving. And in between the spines are little tube feet, especially on the bottom. Whoa, look at that movement. So he walks with his spines, but he's little tube feet in here, and that's what he uses to grab onto things. But looking carefully, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are actually 10 radial parts to this animal. Actually, the starfish is his cousin.
Are you serious? You can't be serious.
Absolutely. The starfish here is also an echinoderm, but notice he has 5-fold symmetry instead of 10.
Yeah.
This starfish does. On the bottom, look. We see the spines, we see the tube feet. His mouth is in the center there.
So there is some similarity here, even though externally it looks a lot different.
A lot different. Actually, you want to see something that looks a lot different?
Sure.
Which is a cousin to the starfish and the sea urchin?
All right. It almost looks like a rock.
Yes. I got to be careful. He's squirting on me. This is a sea cucumber. He has spines. He has 2 feet.
Oh my goodness.
You would never know it until you studied really hard that this also is an echinoderm. He's not very happy being out of the water, so let me put him back in.
Yeah, so these are all related, even though they look very, very different.
Related in their creation. Not in an evolutionary sense, but our creator took this phylum of life, the echinoderms, and created this and this and this on a similar pattern. And that's what we see across the entire realm of life, similarities and differences.
So what makes them different?
Well, genetically, they share most of their genes in common, but there are developmental genes. They're called Hox genes that set up these patterns in the animal as it develops. They develop from a single cell. And in one of them, they set up a 5-fold symmetry. Another, they set up a 10-fold symmetry. Another one, they make this long, skinny animal. They control the development of the embryo in these amazing ways.
So what you're saying, when we look at this from a molecular or genetic perspective, what we're finding is really a fascinating design in all of that.
Absolutely.
But what we've heard in the conventional paradigm, the conventional story tells us that it's those random changes that has brought about all of this.
Sure. Back in the 1800s, when life was simple, when they didn't know what was happening inside the cell, they didn't know how complex genetics was, you can imagine all sorts of things. But now that we know what actually happens behind the scenes, the story gets a lot more complicated. You see, I like to say the genome is four-dimensional. Well, we have a one-dimensional string called DNA. And if you want to draw that out, you have to write all the letters of DNA out on all 3 billion of them. And then you have to draw lines or arrows from one part to another part, because this part turns this part off, this part interferes with this part enhances this. It's this huge two-dimensional interaction network. That's where you have a two-dimensional genome.
I mean, let me stop here for a second, because this is really amazing to think about this, because I think in terms of a computer program that it's fairly static. I mean, the instructions are there, but you're talking about a program that is reprogramming itself. It's modifying its own instructions.
Oh, wait till I get to the fourth dimension.
Oh, okay.
Because of the third dimension first. The information in that first dimension, that linear string, has to be organized in such a way that when it falls into the third dimension, it still works.
Well, that's amazing.
Genes that are used together are next to each other in 3D space.
Are you saying that once this thing gets folded up, it's almost like we have a new set of instructions?
Yes, a new level of information.
Unbelievable.
That whoever programmed that first level needed to understand what was going to happen, have it work in the third level.
But you said there's another dimension.
Oh yeah, the fourth dimension is time.
And how does that work?
The genome changes shape over time. Maybe you eat something that's bad for you, and your liver says, I can get rid of that toxin. Now, the chromosomes in the liver will change shape, expose that new protein gene, make copies of it, build a brand new protein that can kill off that toxin, and when it's not needed anymore, they'll change shape again and fold back.
Oh my goodness.
Dynamic programming. All 3 levels change in the 4th level, time.
Rob, that's so far beyond anything that we know, even in our most complex software systems, that it's almost beyond imagination to think that someone would look at that and say it all happened by chance.
Yes, and it only brings glory to God.
It does.
You can't build something like that up one thing at a time. You need it to function. In all this interlocking 4-dimensional complexity, it's not something you can do one letter at a time with natural selection.
It all has to be there.
Yeah, in the same way when we talk about the environment out here on the coral reef, if you don't have all these interlocking pieces of that puzzle, you don't have that ecology. The system will come crashing down if you just remove a couple of very important factors that are there. They have to be together or it doesn't happen.
So not only did we have this interdependency, this mutualism, so to speak, down at the genetic level, now we even make it more complex by saying there is that same mutualism at the higher level as well.
Yes. In fact, the entire world has a mutualism.
It's impossible to think that all of this could have happened just by a series of slow processes over billions of years.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
It's clear that the world we live in is incredibly interdependent. From the smallest bio
I don't know if anybody just saw this, but I've got to get new shoes because the front of my shoe, the sole of it just folded underneath itself. And now I've got a very floppy shoe. So I'm getting flippers. So if you hear any weird clicking noises, it's just my shoe up here. Gee whiz. Okay. All right. So I know there was a lot that was covered just then in that section of the video, and I would be a liar if I didn't tell you I hadn't watched that many times, especially that section where he discusses the dimensionality of genetics and the genes. I had to really absorb it. I had to watch it a few times. I had to do my own study on it. I had genetics back in college, and so some of the things that he covered, I'd covered in the basic genetics class that I took at Freed, actually. But I never had it explained to me in that sense. And so just to cover a little bit of what he said before we get into the next thing I want to discuss and the importance of what we're fixing to discuss, I just want to cover it again so that you're not necessarily lost. Some of you may have got us like, yep, totally get it. Some of you are like, I don't know what just happened. But what he was explaining was really important. That your DNA, everybody knows what that double helix looks like, that strand of DNA. Everybody has seen it. That's literally what gets posted behind the word science. If you see science, you think of a DNA strand in beakers, right? So that DNA strand, it represents information that controls everything about us. Okay. So what he was saying is that strand, that little strand, once it gets actually stretched out, all 3 billion base pairs, those little connectors that connect the double helix, those two strands, that double helix, they have base pairs that they're attached to. They have all this information. So what happens is, in that 2-dimension, what he was saying is that certain sections of that strand of DNA, when it folds over on it to each other, it actually connects and makes new genes, new proteins to do certain functions. Okay. The 3rd dimension is that when you see those chromosomes, those little X chromosomes, all of that DNA is folded up. All that strand of DNA is folded up in those X designs. And so in 3D space, as they're folded on top of each other, they have to be folded on top of each other in a way when they talk to each other, when they interact, when these base pairs interact, it's not just gobbledygook. It's actually doing something functional. That is mind-blowing. That's truly mind-blowing. When you've got 3 million base pairs all stacked up on top of each other, how is it done in such a way where it's doing exactly what it needs to do for you to be living the way that you're living, for the way that you're looking, to do everything that it needs to do? To be done by chance really gets beyond statistical probability. Now, he did mention time as the 4th dimension. Over time, as you get exposed to certain things, that gene has the ability to change shape, to expose itself to a toxin or something that has entered your body, and make antibodies for it. I know everybody has heard of that. So antigens, things that are foreign to your body, they'll make antibodies for it. So they'll change shape, expose that antigen to certain proteins. It'll replicate and make antibodies that will bind with the antigen, and it will neutralize the antigen, because a lot of what antigens are will bind. You know, if you've heard of free radicals, you know, and things of that nature that may cause cancer. So what happens is these antigens will bind with certain parts of your body, certain parts of your cells, and you don't want that to happen. So what your body does is it creates antibodies to give it something to actually connect to. That's amazing. So having said all of that, when we think back to when life started and the explanation of how life gets started, we're talking about DNA and this replicating of this information. How that occurs requires multiple things working at the same time. And that's the big issue that's literally the number one issue that cannot be bridged right now in science without there being intelligent design, somebody being a creator. And so as we look further, the DVD dilemma. It's kind of weird sounding, I know, but it'll make more sense here in just a moment. Now, RNA has been suspected to be the starting material that got everything going. You know, that we don't know exactly how it got started, but we're saying that RNA, ribose nucleic acid, not sorry, I'm getting all tongue twisted, deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA can do a couple of functions that DNA cannot. And so they're saying that RNA, or mRNA, messenger RNA, was the first thing that really got started because it can do a couple of functions that the DNA can't do on its own. Okay. Now, here's a couple of problems. Let's just grant them that RNA formed by itself, even though the statistics of, and this is calculated, and I can give you the article, 1 in 10 to the 150th power. That means one chance with 1 in 150 zeros behind it. That's an astronomically big number. You couldn't actually count to the end of that number in a couple of lifetimes if you started right now. That's how big of a number that is. Now, grant them that. saying, okay, it only had to happen once. We let it happen once. Okay, well, granted, RNA alone cannot explain the genetic code, the information that is there. And it can explain how it started replicating, because you need certain cellular machinery to actually replicate it, because RNA doesn't do that on its own. So let me go to the next slide here. All right. This is where the DVD comes into play. Here's an analogy to help understand this a little bit. We all know what DVDs are. If I was talking to a younger crowd, I might have to explain what a DVD is. Isn't that crazy? But a DVD, obviously, we, really enjoyed DVDs when they came out on the scene. We got rid of those VHSs. I actually still have all of mine. I don't know about you guys, but DVD, these discs can hold a lot of information, a lot of great information. Without the DVD player, it's useless. Without the DVD player being able to decode all that information and give you a visual and audio of that information, you don't know what that information is. Now, here's the problem. What if the instructions for making a DVD player are on the DVD? You're never going to have one. You're not going to have a DVD player. Therefore, you're not going to have more DVDs. You're not going to be able to access that information. And that's exactly what's being told right now. If you just have RNA, you still don't have ribosomes. You still don't have the things that are needed for translation and transcription, which is really what, if you get into genetics, that's how genes are copied and made in the cell. So again, RNA and DNA represented by the DVD, that cellular machinery, ribosomes I'm talking about that help with transcription, that's like the DVD player. If RNA had the information, that's great and all, but if you didn't have all those other things working with it, you can't access that information. You can't replicate it. I want to read you a quote real quick. And I've got it accessed here. All right, let me get to it. Now, this was a biologist named Frank Salisbury explained this problem in a paper in the American Biology Teacher. That's the name of the paper. Now, this is what Frank had to say about it. Said, it's nice to talk about replicating DNA molecules arising from a soupy sea. But in modern cells, this replication requires the presence of subtle enzymes. The link between DNA and the enzyme is highly complex, involving RNA and an enzyme for its synthesis on a DNA template, ribosomes, enzymes to activate the amino acids, and to transfer RNA molecules. How, in the absence of the final enzyme, could selection act upon DNA and all the mechanisms for replicating it? It's as though everything must happen at once. The entire system must come into being as one unit, or it's worthless. There may be a way out or ways out of this dilemma, but I don't see them at the moment. Now, this is a scientist who is truthfully and honestly recognized the dilemma. He is saying, kind of as it was explained right there at the end of the segment that we watched, these things are mutual. They cannot really exist outside of one another. These things have to be in the system working together for the system to even be. You can't start out on a unicycle, build it up, and then end up on a bicycle. That's not how this works. You've got to have everything functioning together all at once to have the system functioning the way that we do now. And I realize, I get it truly, that a lot of this stuff can put people to sleep. To my shame, might have fallen asleep in genetics once or twice. So I understand that, hey, if you don't have a big background in this, it can be a little overwhelming. But the big takeaway is that science, even though science tells you in the classroom, tells you in books, tells you, however, that we've got these answers, it's not actually the case. They have answers, but they really don't have an explanation. And a lot of what their faith is based on, pretty shaky. I wouldn't want to make my bet on what's found by earthly fallible scientists as my belief system. Now, look, I'm a scientist myself, okay? I get that. I use science every day, and I know that I've told you this. Science is a fantastic tool. It's not great for basing your whole entire existence upon your faith and your belief system because it can't explain things before you had any data input. We're grasping at straws. We're going back and seeing what we can see. But what we've come to find through science better fits creation. What did God do in those first 6 days? He created things as systems. He created them as mature, functioning organisms. He didn't create them as infants. He didn't create them. He didn't flick the universe into motion and let everything evolve as we see it today. That's really not what we see. We have a bunch of mutualistic relationships, like they said, even down at the genetic level, all the way up to really complex organism relationships. You think about pollination of insects and, pollinating insects, bees. You think a lot of pollination would occur without bees? That's why the bee shortage has been such a big deal. There's a lot of flowers that won't get pollinated if there's a big bee shortage. That's something you don't really think about. It's something we take for granted. But that's just a very small example of mutual relationships where both are needed for both to work. So I'm going to leave it here. We've got 1 minute. Hey, look, that's 2 weeks in a row. What is this? Is there any comments or any questions, kind of what we covered today? Next week, we're going to get into more of, again, what we see, you see monkey all the way growing up to man, that kind of thing. We're going to really kind of cover more of that and what we can expect to see as far as change over time in organisms, and explain maybe what micro versus macro evolution looks like. That's the final bell. Last chance, comments, questions. Completely understand. That's okay. I hope you guys have a great week. Let's end in a prayer. Dear Lord, thank you so much for this day. Thank you for all the many blessings that you've bestowed upon us. We're so grateful for this world, your creation, the beauty of it, the complexity of it. Lord, we know that you are the all-powerful designer and creator of what we have around us. Lord, again, help us to look for opportunities to be Christians, to not only to defend our faith, but to help share our faith and help spread our faith and build up the kingdom. Lord, we know that we have many that are struggling with different things. I pray that you be with each one of their ailments and situations. I pray, Lord, that again, we can be a part of the solution. Help us to look to be a part of that solution for whoever's hurting in whatever capacity. Lord, again, we're so thankful for the material blessings we have. Help us to use those for the furtherment of the kingdom. Lord, again, help us to be mindful as we go out this week, that we are Christians foremost in everything that we do, say, and think. Lord, most of all, we're so thankful for your Son, the amazing sacrifice and example that he is to us, giving us a template for how we ought to live and giving us a home in heaven that if we live faithfully, we can access. We ask all of these things in your Son's most high, holy, and matchless name. Amen.